Hello Year 10, I hope you're all doing really well. I just wanted to come and give you a bit of an overview of the USA unit from 1929 to 1945. We're mainly going to focus on the Great Depression, what it was, why it happened, how it affected people, how key presidents tried to deal with it, and then ultimately how World War II lifted America out of that Great Depression. So we're going to start before 1929 with 1920s America. The 1920s had seen a real period of boom in the American economy, and loads of people had been investing in the stock market. So they'd been putting their money into the stock market and then becoming richer when they sold their stocks for a higher price. And it wasn't just kind of really key businessmen and really wealthy people that were doing this, just ordinary people were putting their money in the stock market. Some people were even borrowing money from the banks in order to invest it. So the stock market prices had been going up and people had been getting rich quick. However, from the autumn of 1929, this increase started to slow down. In response, some experts started selling their stocks. That led to a huge amount of panic selling. So much so that the impact on the stock market was that it collapsed. On Thursday the 24th of October, known as Black Thursday, nearly 13 million shares were traded and share prices collapsed. This event, known as the Wall Street crash, is what triggers the Great Depression, which takes us from 1929 all the way through to the end of World War II. So, it was Herbert Hoover, who was president when this happened. And he has a really kind of tough reputation. Because he wasn't president for very long after this, a lot of his policies didn't really get a chance to have a really significant impact. He was also a Republican, and at that time Republicans believed in ideas of rugged individualism, laissez-faire, i.e. the government shouldn't interfere in people's lives and people should get themselves out of difficulty. So his early policies followed those kinds of principles. It's what any Republican president would have done. He does do things that are helpful though. He cuts taxes. The Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act is to protect US farmers because it meant that products coming from overseas were significantly more expensive, so that was to try to encourage people to buy homegrown items. He also set up relief agencies and spent huge amounts of money on supporting people who had lost their jobs. However, these early policies aren't enough and people are living in really, really, really tough conditions. By the end of 1929, 2.5 million people were unemployed, and this figure had soared to 13 million by 1932. People who were unemployed, lots of them also lost their homes and resorted to living in Hoovervilles. Now these were just like shanty towns. They were temporary shelters that people had put together with whatever they could find to provide their families with some kind of shelter. The conditions were absolutely appalling. Sanitation was disgusting, disease was rife. People were living in really, really extreme circumstances. The name Hooverville is to mock Herbert Hoover. Other things were used to mock him as well. Hoover flags were people's pockets turned out to show they had no money. Hoover blankets were newspapers that people used to sleep under. In 1932 then, Hoover put new policies into place. The ERA, the Emergency Relief Act, gave $300 million to state governments to help the unemployed. The Home Loan Bank Act was to try to stimulate house building and house ownership. Another key feature of the Great Depression in Hoover's time are the bonus marches. These were World War I veterans who, in 1918, at the end of World War I, had been promised a bonus. Now, this bonus was due to be paid in 1945. However, because of the circumstances, they wanted it early. They marched to Washington and set up a Hooverville. Now, the money just wasn't available to pay them their bonus, and Hoover offered them their fares to go back home. About 5,000 refused, though, and stayed on in the Hooverville. Violence erupted, the army was sent in, People were killed, people were injured. This went a long way to destroying the difficult reputation that Hoover already had. He was painted as someone who didn't care, painted as someone who was happy to use violence against people who'd lost everything. And that definitely contributed to Roosevelt coming to power in the elections of 1933. Now, Roosevelt was an entirely different figure. He was a Democrat for a start, and whilst Hoover was quite a hard-faced businessman, Roosevelt was a much more accessible kind of a figure. He was the type of person that you'd be quite happy perhaps to go up to and have a chat with. He brought with him a huge amount of change in terms of the response to the Great Depression. That doesn't mean that everything was new. Some of Hoover's policies were still used, and the ideas for them definitely influenced Roosevelt's ideas. The first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency were really busy, and that's where the idea of the 100 days comes from. After this 100 days, Roosevelt was said to have commented this would be a good time for a beer. In that time then, he set up his New Deal. This was based on the principles of relief, recovery and reform, and these ideas were going to lift America out of the Great Depression. He used the radio to communicate with the American public to try to boost their morale and raise their confidence. These were called his fireside chats. He also set up, or his government set up, a huge number of alphabet agencies. These were government organisations that were focused on different areas of relief, recovery, reform. So, for example, you have the Emergency Banking Act, the EBA. You have the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. Hopefully you can see how the idea of alphabet agencies came about as a name. However, by 1934, there were still 10 million people unemployed, so it was clear that the New Deal wasn't actually working as quickly as they'd hoped. That meant that a second New Deal was needed. This comprised 4 different areas. The WPA was the Works Progress Administration, and this was about creating jobs and a massive relief programme. The National Labour Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, was about collective bargaining and the power of labour unions. The Fair Labour Standards Act was about making sure that there was a minimum wage and maximum hours so that employers couldn't exploit people desperate for a job. And perhaps most importantly, the Social Security Act. This was the first time in American history that the government had accepted the basic responsibility for the basic living standards of all its citizens. So, this all sounds really good on paper. However, there were plenty of people that opposed it. Roosevelt was a Democrat, so it made sense that some Republicans were going to be against the New Deal. Some Republicans felt like the New Deal was going OTT, that it extended the power of the government. They felt that Roosevelt was acting in an unconstitutional manner, that he was using powers that he didn't and shouldn't have. Some individuals opposed the New Deal as well. Some people felt it had done too much, some people felt it had done way too little and taken too long. There were judges, especially Republican ones, in the Supreme Court who also opposed the New Deal. In 1937, Roosevelt had threatened to try to retire these judges in order to replace them with younger Democrat-supporting judges. So, how successful was the New Deal? Well, in some ways, the economy was boosted and jobs were created. However, these were often in short-term situations. There was opposition, as we've just said, and the fact that there was a need for a second New Deal perhaps shows us that the first New Deal wasn't as successful as we might have thought. What is the absolute game changer, though, is the outbreak of World War II. This happens generally in 1939, but America joins the war in 1941. Soon after, in early 1942, Roosevelt sets up the War Production Board. Now, his key idea here was to outproduce the enemy. to use whatever kind of industrial infrastructure there was to focus all manufacturing onto the war effort. This created huge numbers of jobs, and it meant ultimately that this was one of the reasons why the Allies won the war. When Nazi Germany ran out of aircraft and ships, America was still producing them, and they could keep going when Germany couldn't. So huge numbers of jobs were created through the industry related to the war effort. Jobs were also created through conscription, and then women were able to get more jobs as men went to the military as well. So what this means is that World War II is a massive break for America. It absolutely, without a doubt in my mind, means that America can recover from the Great Depression. So you've got three reasons why America recovers: the work of Hoover, the work of Roosevelt, and then World War II. So, is everything perfect after World War II? Let's think about that. People were richer. People had money left over at the end of the month once they'd paid their bills. They were becoming affluent. This meant that they had money to spend on stuff. They were consumers. So that meant they were buying things like televisions, cars, washing machines, fridges, all of those kinds of products. Many people were moving from the centre of the cities to the suburbs as well because they had a car, they could live further out. However, not everybody benefited from these changes by any stretch. Black Americans in particular absolutely did not benefit from all of these positive changes that had come with the war. They were very often in receipt of really poor treatment and much lower wages than white people doing the same job. They were very often excluded from these new suburbs and actually stopped from buying these new houses. So what was created were all white communities. What this means is that there's a huge amount of poverty in the middle of all of this plenty.